My husband forgot his Apple Watch on the charger, and a message lit up the screen saying, "Last night was perfect." That morning, I quietly followed him. Irene Hensley stood in the doorway of that studio like she'd wandered into the wrong life. Her hands worried the strap of a quilted handbag. Her eyes swept the room, the piano, the mirrors, her own husband frozen mid-step with a rose trembling in his fist, and found nothing in any of it worth stopping on, not even Walter. "Is this the water aerobics?" she asked the room, pleasant, a little apologetic, like she might be in someone's way. Walter didn't answer. I watched his face do something I will never be able to fully describe to anyone who wasn't standing in that hallway, a kind of controlled collapsing, the look of a man taking a hit he'd been bracing for all morning and still hadn't braced enough. "Irene, love," he finally said. "It's me. It's Walter." She smiled at him the way you'd smile at a friendly stranger who'd complimented your coat. "Well, aren't you sweet?" I heard Cameron exhale through his nose. Slow, controlled, a sound I recognized from 9 years of watching him absorb bad news without letting his face show it. He set the rose down on the piano bench, walked to the sound system in the corner, and pressed play on something already queued up and waiting. Etta James. At last. I want to say the room got quiet, but it was already quiet. What happened instead was that the air changed, the way it does right before rain, and Irene's hand, the one still gripping the quilted bag, went slack. "That's our song," she said, to no one, to the ceiling, to some room 40 years back that only she could see the door to. Walter crossed the floor before the second line of the song finished. He didn't ask her to dance. He just held out his hand, the same rose still visible where he'd left it, and after a second that felt longer than the 11 days I would spend on this before it was over, Irene Hensley took it. They weren't good. His feet were unsteady and hers were worse, and twice the instructor, a compact woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled back tight, had to reach out to catch Irene's elbow before she drifted into the piano. But for 2 minutes and 40 seconds, an old man who had introduced himself to his own wife 30 seconds earlier held her like she was the only fixed point left in a world that kept sliding out from under him. I forgot, for those 2 minutes, that I had followed my husband here, convinced I was about to catch him in an affair. Cameron found me in the hallway when the song ended. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who'd been caught holding something fragile and was trying to figure out how to set it down without breaking it. "How long have you been standing there?" he said. "Long enough. Mindy." He said my name like it cost him something. "It's not what you think." "I don't know what I think anymore, Cameron. I found your watch. It said last night was perfect." Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly. Recognition. Like I'd handed him a receipt for a purchase he'd made and forgotten to explain. "Grace sent that," he said. "Grace Okafor. She runs the programs here. We had the full dress rehearsal last night. Everyone who's dancing Friday ran the whole thing back to back. No stops. First time all 4 couples got through it clean. She texted me at 11:40 because she knew I'd still be up worrying about it. Dancing Friday. Dancing what exactly?" He looked past me, down the hall, to where Elena, the instructor, was helping Walter walk Irene to a folding chair, murmuring something low and steady the whole way. Grief and relief were fighting for space on his face in a way I hadn't seen since his mother's funeral. "Come inside," he said. "Let me show you what I've actually been doing on Thursday mornings for the last 14 months. The studio at Oak Ridge Community Center smelled like floor wax and old radiator heat, and along one wall someone had taped up a hand-lettered banner that read, "Second Step Thursday Confidence Class." The letters slightly uneven, clearly made by someone without a laminator and a lot of heart. Grace Okafor met us at the door before Cameron could explain anything himself. She was somewhere in her 50s, broad-shouldered, wearing a cardigan with a laminated visitor badge clipped crooked to the collar, and she had the particular calm of someone who had spent 12 years running senior programs for the county and had stopped being surprised by anything that walked through her door, including, apparently, an unannounced wife. "You must be Mindy," she said, and put her hand out like this was a perfectly normal introduction. "I've heard your name maybe 400 times. Cameron talks about you the way most people talk about the weather right before a hurricane hits. Nervous and constant. I followed him here," I said, because it felt important that someone in this room know I wasn't proud of it. "Good," Grace said, unbothered. "Half the wives who find out about this program find out by following their husbands. The other half find out because we run out of tissues at the gala and somebody posts about it online. Sit down. I'll get you a coffee that's been sitting on that burner since 8, and you can decide for yourself whether to be angry." I sat. Cameron told me the rest standing up, hands in his pockets, the way he does when he's working up to something he's rehearsed and still can't get to come out smoothly. His mother, Margaret, had loved to dance her whole life. County fairs, wedding receptions, the kitchen linoleum on a Saturday morning with the radio on. His father, Frank, had danced with her for 31 years until Parkinson's took his balance, and then his coordination, and then, 6 years before he died, his ability to hold his own wife upright for longer than a slow turn near the couch. Cameron had watched his mother keep asking his father to dance anyway, every anniversary. Watched his father say no every year because he couldn't stand what he'd become in her arms, until eventually she stopped asking, not out of anger, just out of mercy. She never got to dance with him again. Cameron said. Not once in 6 years. He died first. She died 14 months ago. And the last thing she ever said to me that made any sense, the stroke had already taken most of her words by then, was, "Tell your father I still wanted to." I hadn't known that. 9 years married, and I hadn't known the exact shape of what his mother said to him at the end, because he'd told me she died peacefully and let me believe that was the whole sentence. 3 weeks after the funeral, I saw a flyer at the library for a senior dance social, he said. I wasn't going to do anything with it. I just couldn't stop thinking about all the men in this town who were about to lose their nerve the same way my dad did, except most of them still had a wife standing right in front of them, waiting. I called Grace. I told her I'd teach for free if she'd give me a room on Thursday mornings. You can't dance, I said. It came out smaller than I meant it to. At our wedding, you stepped on my feet for 4 straight songs. I still can't really, he said, and for the first time all morning, something like a smile got through. Elena teaches the actual steps. I do the other part. What's the other part? Grace answered before he could. He talks them into it, she said. Walter's been coming for 4 months, and it took him 3 of them just to hold Elena's hand for a count of 8 without apologizing. Your husband sits with these men before every class and tells them the same thing every week, practically word for word, and every week it works a little more. You're not going to fail. You're just scared, I said, quoting the sentence I'd overheard through the window an hour earlier and watching it land on Cameron's face like I'd handed him back something of his mother's. Something like that, he said. I want to tell you I understood everything by 10 a.m. that Tuesday and went home lighter than I'd left. That isn't what happened. What happened was that Grace's coffee went cold in my hands while I sat in a folding chair watching my husband, a man who tracks freight logistics for Halbrook Distribution for a living, who alphabetizes the spice rack, who has never once in 9 years cried in front of me, kneel down next to an 81-year-old widower named Samuel Ostrowski and talk him through the particular terror of putting your hand on a woman's waist for the first time since your wife of 40 years passed. I told myself the strange feeling in my chest was relief. Mostly it was. Underneath the relief, though, was something else. Something I didn't have language for yet, and it took the better part of that week to surface. The sick, quiet understanding that my husband had been carrying his mother's dying request around inside him for over a year, alone, and had decided somewhere in there that I wasn't someone he could hand it to. The strange detail I noticed first came 4 days later, on a Saturday, when I found a receipt in the pocket of his gray jacket, the one that had been at the tailor's the morning I followed him. $340 for alterations, paid in cash, dated 3 weeks earlier, and a second line item beneath it that made no sense to me. Hensley, hem, 2 pairs, no charge. I told myself it was nothing. Tailors comp things sometimes. Old customers get discounts. Then I found the bank statement 2 days after that, the one Cameron didn't know I'd seen because he still does our finances on a shared login I set up back when we got married and never bothered to close. A recurring transfer, $180 a month, going out to something called Brightwater Senior Living @N Activities Fund for the last 11 months. My hands went cold holding that statement, not shaking yet, just cold, the particular stillness of a body deciding whether to be afraid. I asked him about it that night, and he didn't lie, which somehow made it worse, because it meant he'd simply decided a year ago that this was a category of his life I wouldn't be told about. Not out of malice, just out of some private math he'd done that I wasn't part of. Irene needs one-on-one aid time to leave the memory unit for class, he said. Medicaid doesn't cover the extra staffing hour it takes to get her dressed into a wheelchair van and back. Walter's on a fixed income. I cover it so he doesn't have to choose between rent and the one afternoon a week his wife still knows his name. $180 a month for 11 months. That's almost $2,000, Cameron. I know exactly what it is. I do our taxes. Why wouldn't you tell me that? He was quiet long enough that I understood the real answer before he said it. Because the year my mother died, you were also managing your dad's diagnosis, and I watched you carry that mostly by yourself, because you didn't want to add weight to a house that already felt like it was sinking. I thought I was doing you a favor. I think now I was just doing what I saw my dad do, deciding for someone else what they could handle instead of asking them. I didn't have a response to that. I just sat with it, the way you sit with a bruise you didn't notice getting, pressing on it slightly just to confirm it's real. The next strange detail arrived in the form of a manila envelope. I just sat with it, the way you sit with a bruise you didn't notice getting, pressing on it slightly just to confirm it's real. The next strange detail arrived in the form of a manila envelope, county seal in the corner, addressed to Grace Okafor, but left, unopened, on the community center's front desk where Cameron had picked it up by accident along with a stack of raffle tickets for the gala. He brought it home without thinking much of it. I opened it while he was in the shower, because by then some old habit of vigilance in me hadn't fully died, even with the affair theory dead and buried. Notice of proposed budget reallocation. Public comment period. it read, from the County Department of Health and Human Services. Underneath, in the flat, bloodless language governments use for the worst news, the Oak Ridge Community Center's senior programming line item, $184,000 annually, was slated for elimination in the coming fiscal year, with the building itself recommended for a 40-year ground lease to a private developer under a mixed-use redevelopment initiative. Public comment closed the following Monday. Final vote 10 days after that. I told myself it was a formality. Governments propose things like this constantly and quietly walk them back. I'd read about budget scares before. They rarely amounted to anything. Then I called Grace directly, and she told me the truth in the flat, tired voice of someone who had already watched this exact scenario happen to 2 other county programs in the last 5 years. Commissioner Denning chairs the subcommittee, she said. Paul Denning. He's not a villain. He's a man staring down a $2.3 million county shortfall and looking for line items nobody's going to protest loudly. Problem is, senior day programs never protest loudly. Our people don't march. They don't have the knees for it. Some days they don't have the memory for it. He's not wrong that we're an easy cut. He's just never sat in that studio on a Thursday. My stomach dropped in the specific way it does when a thing you thought was somebody else's problem turns out to have your address on it. What happens to Walter and Irene if this closes? Walter loses the one afternoon a week his wife recognizes him without a fight, Grace said, and I lose the only thing that's kept 11 widowers in this town from disappearing into their houses and not coming back out. I've buried 2 of my own participants to isolation-related causes in 6 years, Mindy. Not dramatic ones, just quiet ones. A man stops coming to things and 6 weeks later somebody finds him. I hung up the phone with my hands actually shaking now, the real kind, and I understood that the $2,000, the rose, the hemmed pants, the entire secret architecture of my husband's Thursday mornings was standing on ground that was about to be sold out from under it. I tried to fix it the way I fix most things, which is badly and too fast. I wrote a 4-paragraph email to the county's public comment portal at 11 p.m. that Sunday, heavy on outrage, light on specifics, and hit send before I let myself reread it. I found out 3 days later, from Grace, that it had landed in a folder with 400 other public comments, most of them equally impassioned, all of them functionally invisible to a subcommittee that had already, by all appearances, made up its mind. Passion doesn't move Denning, Grace told me, not unkindly, over the same cold coffee in the same folding chair. Numbers do. He's an actuary by training, before politics. If you want him to hear you, you have to speak his language. I didn't know his language. I worked in event coordination for a regional hotel chain. I knew catering minimums and vendor contracts, not municipal budgets. My first attempt to fix things had failed in exactly the way Grace predicted, and I sat in my car in the community center parking lot afterward, hands still faintly unsteady on the wheel, feeling for the first time the particular helplessness of caring enormously about something you have no actual leverage over. Dr. Priya Nandakumar came into the story on a Wednesday, 11 days before the gala, when Grace asked her to write a letter for the public record. Dr. E. Nandakumar was a board-certified geriatric neurologist at County Memorial Hospital, 9 years into a specialty most people don't think about until they need it, and she came to Oak Ridge that afternoon not because anyone paid her to, but because she'd been quietly consulting on Irene Hensley's case for 2 years and had watched firsthand what a single Etta James record could do for a woman who sometimes couldn't recall what she'd eaten that morning. It's called musical memory preservation, she explained, sitting across from me and Grace at a folding table that still had a stack of raffle tickets on it. The brain regions that process music and long-encoded emotional memory are among the last affected by Alzheimer's-type dementia. A familiar song, especially one tied to a strong emotional imprint, a wedding song, say, can access memory pathways that verbal cues can't reach anymore. What you watched happen in that studio, Mrs. Voss, isn't sentiment, it's neurology. Can you put that in writing? I asked. For the county. I already have, she said, and slid a 2-page letter across the table, her hospital letterhead at the top, 3 peer-reviewed citations in the footnotes. I've testified in front of budget committees before. They tend to trust a citation more than a story. I'd suggest you bring both. Grace looked at that letter like it was the first real weapon anyone had handed her in weeks. Thomas Reyes, regional director of the county's Area Agency on Aging, called Grace 2 days later, and Grace put him on speaker in the studio's back office so I could hear it too. I've read Denning's proposal 3 times. Reyes said, his voice tired in the specific way of a man who'd spent 18 years watching budgets get balanced on the backs of programs nobody photographed. The math isn't wrong. The building's assessed value alone would cover almost 1/5 of the shortfall if it's leased out. What the proposal doesn't account for is the offset. Every isolated senior who ends up in an ER for a fall, a missed medication, an untreated depressive episode, costs the county's own indigent care fund an average of $11,000 per incident. I can get you the county's own numbers on that. It won't stop the vote by itself. But it'll make Denning defend a number instead of a feeling, and numbers are the only language he loses arguments in. What would stop the vote? I asked. There was a pause on the line, the kind that told me before the words did that the answer wasn't going to be simple. Public pressure ahead of Monday's final session, tied to something the county can't spin as sentimental, Reyes said. If your Gala Friday demonstrates real community investment, real dollars, real turnout, real press, Denning's colleagues on that subcommittee start asking him why he's cutting something the public just proved it'll pay to keep. I've seen votes flip in 12 hours on less than that. I've also seen them not flip at all. I won't lie to you about the odds. And Naomi Castillo from Channel 12 News called Grace on Thursday morning, the day of what should have been an ordinary class, because a friend of a donor had forwarded her Dr. Nandakumar's letter, along with a grainy phone video someone had taken of Walter and Irene's dance the week before, the same dance I realized that I'd watched from the hallway 11 days earlier, someone else's phone catching it from a different angle entirely. Naomi had covered county government for 5 years and had the specific instinct of a reporter who knew exactly which stories her assignment desk would actually run. I don't do puff pieces on senior centers, she told Grace bluntly, on speaker again, because by then I'd become something like a permanent fixture in that back office. I do them on funding fights that have a clock on them. You've got a vote Monday and a video that's already at 8,000 views on a community Facebook group. That's a story. I want to be there Friday night. Grace looked at me across the table, and I understood, without either of us saying it, that this was the first piece of good luck we'd had since the manila envelope showed up. I want to describe what the days between that call and the gala felt like, and the honest truth is they felt like holding your breath for slightly too long, over and over, until it becomes a kind of background hum you stop noticing except in your hands. Cameron barely slept. I watched him run choreography notes at the kitchen table at midnight, watched him call Samuel Ostrowski twice in one day just to talk him down from quitting 3 days before his first public performance in 40 years, watched him field a call from the tailor about a torn seam on Walter's dress pants with the calm, clipped efficiency of a man managing a crisis he'd trained his whole adult life for without knowing it. I finally told him about the budget team's advice, Reyes's numbers, Dr. Nandakumar's letter, Naomi's video, and for the first time in 11 days, he looked at me like I was someone standing next to him in this, instead of someone he had to protect from it. I should have told you all of it a year ago, he said. You should have, I agreed, but I also followed you across town convinced you were having an affair with a woman who turned out to be teaching 80-year-olds the box step for free. We're even on the not telling each other things front, Cameron. He almost laughed. It was the first almost laugh either of us had managed in nearly 2 weeks. The crisis came on Friday, 4 hours before the gala, in the shape of a phone call from Brightwater Senior Living that made Cameron's face go the color of the folding chairs. Irene had had a bad afternoon. Sundowning, the nurse called it. A common late-day agitation in dementia patients, worse than usual that day for reasons nobody could name. And Irene had grown frightened and combative around 3 p.m., refusing to be dressed, refusing the wheelchair van, refusing at one point to acknowledge that Walter, sitting right beside her bed, holding her hand, was anyone she knew at all. She keeps asking for her mother, the nurse told Cameron over speakerphone, Walter's voice breaking inaudibly behind her. I don't think travel is safe for her tonight. I'm sorry. I watched Walter's face on that call. Watched 60 years of marriage compress into the particular devastation of a man being told, gently by a stranger, that tonight might be the night his wife doesn't come back to him even for 4 minutes. We had one dance in her, Walter said, to nobody, to all of us. I thought we'd get one more. Cameron didn't argue with the nurse. He asked one question instead. What's her favorite hour? Not now. Historically, when has she been most herself, on her best days? Mornings, the nurse said, surprised by the question. Almost always mornings, before the day gets long. Cameron looked at his watch, the very same one that had started all of this, glowing on a kitchen counter 11 days earlier, and did the math out loud. Fast, the way he does spreadsheets at work. The gala's not until 7, he said. What if we don't wait for the gala? What if we bring the gala to her in the morning while she's still herself and film it ourselves, properly? On a real camera, not somebody's phone from across a room. We give Naomi that instead. Grace, listening in for ourselves, properly. On a real camera, not somebody's phone from across a room. We give Naomi that instead. Grace, listening in from the studio, didn't hesitate. I can get the AV kid from the high school here in 20 minutes. He owes me for 6 years of free printer access. It's 10 hours before the actual event, I said. Is that even enough time to edit anything? Get it to Naomi? Still make the fundraiser tonight look. It has to be, Cameron said, and something in his voice told me the accountant in him had already run every version of this and landed on the same answer. We don't get another morning to gamble on. We drove to Brightwater at 8:10 the next morning. Saturday would have been too late. The vote was Monday, and Naomi needed something to run by Sunday night's broadcast if it was going to move anyone before 9 a.m. Monday. Walter sat in the backseat of Cameron's SUV holding a single white rose, silent, his hands steady in the specific, deliberate way of a man refusing to let them shake in front of witnesses. Irene was awake when we arrived, sitting by the window in the common room, and for one long, terrible second when Walter walked in, her eyes passed over him with no more recognition than they'd given him 11 days earlier. Then Cameron pressed play on a small speaker Elena had brought, and the first 4 notes of At Last moved through that room like weather. Irene's hand found the arm of her chair and gripped it. "Walter!" she said, like she was catching a name falling out of the air before it hit the ground. "You're late. You said 7. Nobody in that room breathed for a second. Walter crossed to her so fast the rose nearly dropped from his hand. "I'm here now," he said. "Will you dance with me?" She did. The high school kid with the camera, a junior named Devin who Grace swore up and down was better at this than half the crews she'd worked with in 12 years of county events, got every second of it, including the moment near the end when Irene laughed, actually laughed, at something Walter murmured against her hair that none of the rest of us ever found out. I cried in that common room, not quietly either. It was the first time in 11 days I'd let myself cry about any of it, and it came out of me all at once. All the fear from the watch, all the guilt from following him, all the grief I hadn't known was sitting in my own chest for a marriage of 54 years I had no actual claim to. The gala itself that Friday night felt almost like an afterthought by comparison, though it shouldn't have, because 211 people showed up to the Oak Ridge Gymnasium in cocktail attire to watch 4 elderly couples perform choreography they'd been rehearsing in secret for months. And by the time Samuel Ostrowski finished his own dance, the one Cameron had talked him through 3 months of terror to get to, the room was on its feet in a way I'd genuinely never witnessed. At any hotel event I'd coordinated in 11 years of doing this professionally. The silent auction and matching grant pledge cards raised $61,400 that night. Naomi's segment on Irene and Walter's morning dance aired at 6 p.m. Sunday, 48 hours before the vote, and by Monday morning it had been shared, according to Naomi's own producer, over 30,000 times across 3 different community pages and 1 statewide news aggregator. The Whitfield Family Foundation, which had quietly offered to match up to $75,000 in community donations, if the county proved public support existed, confirmed the match Sunday night, bringing the total raised to $122,800, nearly the full annual line item Denning had proposed cutting, raised in 5 days by people who mostly didn't have much to spare. I sat in the gallery of the county board meeting Monday morning between Grace and Thomas Reyes, and I watched Commissioner Paul Denning, a trim, unsmiling man in his 60s who had, by every account, believed himself to be making a defensible, unsentimental decision about a shortfall that was very real, sit through 11 minutes of public comment that included Dr. R. Nandakumar's citations, Thomas Reyes's cost offset numbers, and a video clip of an 81-year-old man dancing with his wife of 54 years in a common room at 9 in the morning. He didn't apologize. Not exactly. Men like Denning rarely do, in my limited experience of them. But when the vote came, he moved to amend his own proposal, striking the senior programming cut entirely and redirecting the shortfall search toward 2 vacant administrative positions instead. And he said one sentence into the record that Naomi quoted in her follow-up piece 2 days later: "I underestimated what a line item can hold." The vote to preserve Oak Ridge's funding passed 6-1. The one no vote, I later learned, came from a commissioner who thought the whole thing should have been fully funded a decade earlier and was voting against the amendment as a protest for not going far enough. Grace laughed so hard reading me that detail that she had to sit down. Cameron and I didn't talk about any of it properly, the marriage part of it, until almost 3 weeks later, on a Thursday night after Irene had had 2 more good mornings in a row, and Walter had started, tentatively, teaching Samuel Ostrowski the same steps someone had once taught him. "I kept it from you because I didn't want you to see me as someone who was still grieving his parents a year later," Cameron said. "I thought grief had a deadline, and I was embarrassed I'd missed it. I followed you across town because I was scared of a version of you that doesn't exist," I said. "We're not even. We're both just people who decided the other one couldn't handle something instead of asking." He reached for my hand across the table, the same hand that had once at our wedding missed 4 separate beats, and stepped on my foot so hard I limped through the first dance. "Teach me," I said. "Properly, not the wedding version, the real one." He looked at me the way he'd looked at Walter that morning in the studio doorway, like he already knew this would work. He just needed me to believe it before he said it out loud. "You're not going to fail," he said. "You're just scared." I laughed, and it came out shakier than I meant it to, but I stood up anyway, and I put my hand in his. 6 months later, Irene Hensley no longer recognizes Walter most days. But every Thursday morning, without fail, Cameron drives to Brightwater at 8, sets a small speaker on the windowsill, and plays 4 notes of a song written decades before either of them was born. And every Thursday morning, for at least the length of one dance, an 81-year-old man gets his wife back. I stand in the doorway now instead of the hallway. Cameron always waves me in,